The smell hit me first. Sweet, chemical, wrong. I stood frozen in the doorway of what should have been a simple storage room beneath Marcus's gas station, my flashlight beam dancing across rows of unmarked barrels that definitely weren't supposed to be there. The concrete floor was stained with something dark that made my stomach clench, and in the corner, a stack of documents bore official seals I recognized from my years working at the county environmental office. Documents that should never have been in a civilian's possession. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Above me, I could hear Tony Castellano moving around the main floor of Route 22, gas and go, his heavy boots creating a rhythm that suddenly sounded less like routine maintenance and more like a countdown. He thought I was upstairs reviewing quarterly reports, playing the grieving widow trying to make sense of her husband's business. He had no idea I'd discovered the hidden entrance behind the false wall in Marcus's office, or that I'd been planning this moment for 3 weeks. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, snapping photos of serial numbers on the barrels, the leaked chemicals pooling near a drain that led God knows where, and those government documents that revealed a conspiracy reaching far beyond one small-town gas station. Every click of the camera felt like a small act of rebellion against the people who had destroyed my husband and thought they could fool his naive little wife. Because that's what they all thought I was. Naive little Vanessa, the environmental compliance officer who'd fallen for the charming gas station owner, who'd trusted him so completely that she never questioned why he'd grown so distant in his final months, why he'd started drinking heavily, why he'd whispered apologies in his sleep. They thought grief had made me helpless, that I'd be content to sell the station and disappear back to my quiet life of filing environmental impact reports. They were wrong. 3 months earlier, I had been exactly what they thought, standing in the funeral home in my black dress, accepting condolences from people who barely knew Marcus. I was drowning in questions no one seemed able to answer. Why had my healthy 42-year-old husband died of a heart attack in his sleep? Why had he been so secretive about the gas station's finances in his final weeks? Why had Tony Castellano been so eager to buy the business from me before Marcus was even in the ground? The funeral felt surreal, like watching someone else's life through thick glass. Marcus lay in the casket wearing his best suit, the one I'd bought him for our wedding 5 years ago, and he looked peaceful in a way he hadn't in months. That should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a cold dread I couldn't name. The man I'd married had been vibrant, passionate about environmental protection, excited about running a business that proved you could be profitable while being responsible. The man who'd died had been haunted, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking locks multiple times before bed. Frank Delacroix appeared at my elbow during the viewing, a man I'd never met but who seemed to know Marcus well. He was distinguished in that artificial way some men cultivate, silver-haired and expensively dressed, with cold eyes that didn't match his sympathetic expression. He offered his condolences in the practiced tone of someone who'd done this many times before, and when he mentioned being Marcus's business partner, I felt the first stirring of suspicion. Marcus had never mentioned a business partner. We'd shared everything, or so I'd thought. We'd planned the gas station renovation together, discussed switching to more environmentally friendly fuel options, dreamed about expanding into electric vehicle charging stations. There had been no mention of Frank Delacroix or any partnership agreements. Tony Castellano hovering nearby, pretending to grieve while clearly eager to discuss business matters, only deepened my unease. He'd worked for Marcus for 3 years, managing the day-to-day operations while Marcus focused on the business side, and I'd always found him competent if somewhat cold. Now he was pushing papers at me, talking about immediate sales opportunities, explaining how complicated it would be for me to run the station alone. The pressure felt orchestrated, like a carefully planned campaign to separate me from Marcus's business as quickly as possible. Everyone seemed to have opinions about what I should do, suggestions that all pointed in the same direction. Sell quickly, sell quietly, take the money and start over somewhere else. The urgency made no sense unless there was something they needed to hide. That night, alone in the house Marcus and I had shared, I sat in his home office surrounded by boxes of business documents I'd never paid much attention to before. Marcus had always handled the station's paperwork, and I'd been content to focus on my job at the county environmental office. Now, searching through files for insurance information and business licenses, I began to see patterns that made my professional instincts scream warnings. The Route 22 Gas and Go was profitable, more profitable than it should have been for a small-town station with modest traffic. The monthly revenue reports showed consistent income that exceeded what I'd expect from fuel sales, convenience store purchases, and basic automotive services. When I cross-referenced the numbers with traffic patterns and local economic data, the math didn't add up. Either Marcus had discovered some revolutionary business model, or money was coming from sources that weren't reflected in the official books. More troubling were the invoices from companies I'd never heard of, payments for services that weren't clearly defined. Environmental consulting fees paid to firms that didn't appear in any legitimate databases. Waste disposal costs that seemed astronomical for a single gas station. Equipment purchases that weren't reflected in any inventory I could find. Every document raised new questions, and the answers Marcus might have provided were buried with him. Frank Delacroix's business cards surfaced in one of the files, along with contracts I couldn't decipher, and correspondence that referenced projects with vague names like Cascade Initiative and Cedar Valley Development. The letterhead bore the logo of a company called Pacific Environmental Solutions, which sounded legitimate until I tried to research them and found only a basic website with stock photos and minimal information. My environmental compliance background had taught me to recognize the warning signs of improper waste disposal and illegal dumping operations. Companies that appeared and disappeared, unusually high profits and waste management, vague contracts and mysterious partnerships. Everything I was finding in Marcus's files pointed toward the kind of environmental crimes I'd spent years investigating from the regulatory side. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My husband, the man I'd loved and trusted, the man who'd shared my passion for environmental protection, had been involved in something that went against everything we'd claimed to believe in. Either he'd been complicit in environmental crimes, or he'd discovered something that had cost him his life. I spent that first week after the funeral in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of grief while privately conducting an investigation into my own life. I requested copies of all environmental permits and inspection reports for the gas station, using my professional access to county records. I researched every company name I'd found in Marcus's files, tracing corporate registrations and business licenses. I even drove past the station multiple times, watching the patterns of activity, noting which vehicles came and went at unusual hours. What I discovered made me understand why Marcus had grown so fearful in his final months. The Route 22 Gas and Go wasn't just a gas station. It was a front for an illegal waste disposal operation that was contaminating the groundwater beneath Millbrook and potentially affecting drinking water for thousands of people. The underground storage area I'd discovered wasn't just hiding barrels of toxic waste. It was the hub of a criminal network that included government officials, waste management companies, and business leaders who were profiting from environmental destruction. Marcus hadn't been complicit. He'd been trying to expose them. The documents in that underground room included his notes, his photographs, his desperate attempts to gather evidence of what was happening beneath his business. He discovered that Frank Delacroix and Tony Castellano were using the gas station as a cover for illegal dumping, accepting hazardous waste from companies across the region, and storing it in ways that violated every environmental protection law on the books. The heart attack that killed him hadn't been natural. I found the medical examiner's preliminary report hidden in his desk, a report that noted unusual chemical compounds in his blood, but had been mysteriously withdrawn before a full investigation could be completed. Someone with influence had ensured that Marcus's death would be ruled natural, closing off any questions about what he might have known or who might have wanted him silenced. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that the grieving widow would be too devastated and too naive to continue her husband's investigation. They'd underestimated Vanessa Hartwell, environmental compliance officer, trained investigator, and very angry woman, who now understood that her husband had died trying to protect the community they'd both loved. Helen Vasquez at the town clerk's office became my first crucial ally, though she didn't know it initially. Helen had worked in county records for 25 years, and had developed the suspicious nature that comes from seeing the same names appear in too many questionable transactions. When I requested additional documents related to the gas station and surrounding properties, she began pulling files with a thoroughness that went beyond simple compliance. The pattern she helped me uncover was staggering. Frank Delacroix's Pacific Environmental Solutions had contracts with dozens of businesses across 3 counties, all involving waste management services that somehow ended up connected to properties near the Route 22 gas and go. Shell companies owned parcels of land that surrounded the station, creating a network of storage and disposal sites that had never been properly inspected or permitted. Helen's access to historical records revealed that this operation had been growing for nearly a decade, long before Marcus bought the gas station. The previous owner had been part of the scheme, and when he'd decided to sell, Frank Delacroix had orchestrated Marcus's purchase as a way to maintain their cover. Marcus had been chosen specifically because his environmental background would make the station look legitimate, while providing them with someone who could navigate regulatory requirements. The cruelty of it took my breath away. They'd targeted my husband precisely because of his integrity, using his reputation to shield their crimes, while gradually manipulating him into deeper involvement.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The drinking, the fear, the sleepless nights, all of it made sense now. Marcus had realized he was being used and had tried to find a way out, only to discover that the conspiracy reached far deeper than he'd imagined. Tony Castellano wasn't just the station manager, he was the operational coordinator for the entire dumping network. His role involved scheduling waste deliveries, managing storage rotations, and ensuring that official inspections never coincided with active disposal operations. He'd been reporting Marcus's growing suspicions to Frank Delacroix, helping them monitor his activities and plan their response to his investigation. The government documents I'd found in that underground room were the smoking gun that proved official corruption. Environmental impact assessments had been falsified, inspection reports had been buried, and permits had been issued for activities that never matched what was actually happening on the ground. Someone with significant authority in the state environmental agency was actively protecting this operation, ensuring that regulatory oversight would never expose their crimes. But Marcus had been gathering evidence of everything, building a case that would have brought down the entire network if he'd lived to present it. Hidden in various locations around the gas station, he'd collected soil samples, water quality tests, photographs of illegal dumping activities, and recordings of conversations with Tony and Frank. He'd been preparing to take everything to the FBI when his heart had suddenly stopped. Now that evidence was mine, along with the knowledge of how dangerous these people were and how far they'd go to protect their operation. They'd killed once to keep their secrets safe, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they discovered that Marcus's wife was continuing his investigation. But I had advantages they didn't know about. My professional background had taught me how to gather evidence without alerting suspects, how to document environmental crimes in ways that would hold up in court, and how to work within regulatory systems to build cases that couldn't be dismissed or buried. More importantly, they'd revealed their hand by pressuring me to sell quickly, showing me exactly which aspects of the operation they were most desperate to hide. The next phase of my investigation took me beyond the gas station itself, following the network of properties and companies that supported the illegal dumping operation. Using county records, environmental databases, and simple surveillance, I began mapping the full scope of their activities. What I discovered was a criminal enterprise that was contaminating groundwater across a huge area, affecting not just Millbrook but several surrounding communities. The environmental damage was catastrophic and growing worse every day. Toxic chemicals were leaching into the aquifer that supplied drinking water to thousands of people, creating health risks that would persist for decades. Children in affected areas were already showing elevated levels of certain contaminants, though the connection to the illegal dumping hadn't been established by health officials who didn't know what to look for. This realization transformed my investigation from personal vendetta to urgent public health mission. I wasn't just seeking justice for Marcus's death. I was racing to prevent an environmental disaster that could affect generations of families. The scope of the threat demanded action that went beyond anything I could accomplish alone, But revealing what I knew too early would give the conspirators time to destroy evidence and disappear. I needed a strategy that would expose everything simultaneously, preventing them from limiting the damage or shifting blame to lower-level participants. Most importantly, I needed to stay alive long enough to see justice done and the environmental threat neutralized. Frank Delacroix and his network had already killed once to protect their operation, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they realized how much I'd discovered. The key was maintaining my cover as the naive, grieving widow, while secretly building an airtight case that would bring down the entire conspiracy. They expected me to sell the gas station and disappear, which meant I had a narrow window of opportunity before they became suspicious of my continued presence. Every day I delayed increased the risk of discovery, but rushing would mean losing the chance to gather all the evidence needed to ensure convictions and environmental remediation. As I prepared for the confrontation that would determine everything, I thought about Marcus and the courage he'd shown in his final weeks, trying to expose crimes that threatened our entire community. He'd died before he could complete his mission, but his work had given me the foundation to finish what he'd started. The people who'd killed him thought they were safe, protected by corruption and conspiracy. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The Riverside Diner at 6 a.m. was exactly where I needed to be. Empty except for truckers grabbing coffee and Diane Reeves wiping down tables with the methodical precision of someone who'd been doing the same routine for 20 years. I'd chosen this moment carefully, knowing that Tony Wooden-Castellano never arrived at the gas station before 8, giving me a 2-hour window to begin the most dangerous phase of my investigation. Diane looked up when I entered, her weathered face creasing into a sympathetic smile that I'd grown accustomed to over the past month. She was one of the few people in Millbrook who seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, rather than eager to discuss business opportunities. More importantly, she was someone who noticed things, remembered details, and had lived in this town long enough to recognize when something wasn't quite right. I ordered coffee and settled into the corner booth that offered a clear view of the street leading to the gas station. From here, I could monitor the unusual early morning traffic that had become part of my surveillance routine, while appearing to be nothing more than a lonely widow seeking company and caffeine. The performance had become second nature, but today felt different because today I was going to start asking the questions that would either crack this conspiracy wide open or get me killed. Diane brought my coffee and lingered, clearly wanting to talk but uncertain how to begin. I had been cultivating this relationship for weeks, establishing myself as someone who needed support and guidance, someone who might be grateful enough to overlook certain irregularities, if they were explained the right way. The truth was more complex, but Diane didn't need to know that yet. "You're up early again," she observed, settling into the seat across from me with her own cup. "Having trouble sleeping?" "I keep thinking about Marcus," I replied, which was true enough. "There's so much about the business I don't understand. People keep telling me I should sell, but I feel like I owe it to him to at least try to understand what he was building." Diane's expression shifted slightly, and I caught a flicker of something that might have been guilt or fear. She glanced around the empty diner before leaning forward slightly, lowering her voice even though there was no one to overhear. "Honey, sometimes understanding everything isn't the blessing we think it'll be," she said carefully. "Marcus was a good man, but he got himself mixed up in things that were bigger than he could handle." The admission sent electricity through my veins, but I kept my expression neutral, letting grief and confusion mask my intense focus. This was the opening I'd been working toward, the moment when someone might finally acknowledge that there had been more to Marcus's business than simple gas station operations. "What kind of things?" I asked, allowing my voice to tremble slightly. "Everyone keeps saying that, but no one will tell me what it means. Was he in some kind of trouble?" Diane studied my face for a long moment, clearly weighing how much she could or should reveal. I could see the internal struggle, compassion warring with self-preservation, and I pressed gently forward. "I found some papers in his office that I don't understand," I continued. "Contracts with companies I've never heard of, payments for services that don't make sense. If there's something I should know, something that might help me figure out what to do with the station." "Those companies," Diane said slowly, "they're not the kind of businesses that advertise in the phone book. They handle things that need to be handled quietly, if you understand what I mean." I didn't understand completely, but I nodded encouragingly, letting her control the pace of revelation while my mind raced to catalog every detail she might provide. Frank Delacroix came to see me about 3 weeks before Marcus passed, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Wanted to know if Marcus had been talking to anyone about his business, if he seemed worried or upset about anything. Said he was concerned about his partner's mental state. The timeline aligned perfectly with what I'd discovered in Marcus's notes. 3 weeks before his death, he'd made his most detailed documentation of the illegal dumping activities, including photographs and water quality measurements that proved contamination was spreading. Frank's visit to Diane suggested they'd been monitoring Marcus's behavior, looking for signs that he might expose their operation. What did you tell him? I asked. The truth, that Marcus had been drinking more, staying up late, seemed stressed about something he wouldn't discuss. Frank seemed relieved by that, said it confirmed his concerns about Marcus pushing himself too hard. The manipulation was elegant and cruel. By encouraging people to see Marcus's investigation as evidence of mental health decline, Frank had been preparing a narrative that would discredit any accusations Marcus might eventually make. The drinking, the sleeplessness, the apparent paranoia, all of it could be dismissed as the behavior of someone having a breakdown rather than someone uncovering criminal activity. Did Marcus ever mention anything about problems at the gas station? I pressed. Equipment issues, unusual deliveries, anything that seemed out of the ordinary? Diane's eyes darted away. And I knew I was approaching information she'd been specifically told not to discuss. The fear in her expression was real, suggesting that Frank's influence extended beyond simple business relationships into something more threatening. There were trucks sometimes, she admitted reluctantly. Late at night, early morning, times when regular fuel deliveries wouldn't make sense. Marcus asked me once if I'd noticed them, seemed worried about something, but when I asked what was wrong, he just said he was handling it. The night deliveries were exactly what I'd expected to find evidence of, but having confirmation from a witness gave the pattern credibility that would be crucial when I eventually presented my case. More importantly, Marcus's questions to Diane proved he'd been investigating the unusual activity rather than participating willingly. Did you ever see what those trucks were carrying? I asked. That's not the kind of question folks around here ask, Diane replied, her tone sharpening with warning. Some things are better left alone, especially when they involve people with the kind of connections Frank Delacroix has. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Diane was telling me that curiosity about Frank's operations was dangerous, that people who asked too many questions might face consequences. She was also revealing that Frank's influence in Millbrook extended beyond his business relationships into something that commanded fear and silence. I finished my coffee and thanked Diane for her concern, playing the role of the overwhelmed widow who was beginning to understand that her situation was more complicated than she'd realized. As I prepared to leave, she reached across the table and caught my hand. Vanessa, honey, if you're smart, you'll take Tony's offer for the station and start fresh somewhere else, she said urgently. This town has ways of dealing with people who don't know when to mind their own business, and you've got your whole life ahead of you. The warning was clear, but so was the confirmation that Tony Castellano's eagerness to buy the station was part of a larger strategy to control the situation. They needed me gone, needed the property under their complete control, and they were prepared to use intimidation or worse to achieve that goal. I drove from the diner directly to the county courthouse, where Helen Vasquez was waiting with additional records I'd requested. The building was nearly empty at this early hour, giving us privacy to discuss what she'd discovered, without drawing attention from anyone who might report our conversations to interested parties. Helen's office was a testament to decades of meticulous record-keeping, filing cabinets and document boxes, organized with the precision of someone who understood that information was power. She gestured for me to close the door before pulling out a thick folder that I could see contained far more than the standard property records I'd officially requested. What I'm about to show you never came from me, she said without preamble. If anyone asks, you found these documents through your own research, understand? I nodded, recognizing that Helen was taking a significant personal risk by sharing whatever she'd uncovered. Her willingness to do so suggested that the corruption surrounding the gas station was something she'd been aware of and troubled by for some time. Pacific Environmental Solutions has been active in this county for 8 years, she began, opening the folder to reveal property deeds, business licenses, and permit applications. They started small, handling waste management for a few local businesses, but their operations have expanded dramatically over the past 5 years. The documents told a story of systematic manipulation of local regulations and permit processes. Pacific Environmental Solutions had acquired properties throughout the region, always through shell companies, with names that concealed their connection to Frank Delacroix's main operation. The permits they'd obtained were for activities that sounded legitimate but were vague enough to provide cover for nearly any kind of waste handling. Here's what concerns me most, Helen continued, pointing to a series of inspection reports. These facilities are supposed to be inspected quarterly by state environmental agents, but look at the dates and signatures. The pattern was immediately obvious to someone with my background in environmental compliance. The inspections had been conducted by the same agent every time, always with advance notice and always resulting in perfect compliance ratings. The inspector's signature belonged to someone I recognized from state environmental agency meetings, a senior official who would have the authority to suppress problematic findings or redirect investigations away from sensitive operations. Richard Montrose, I said, recognizing the name. He's been with the state agency for 15 years. Handles high-priority industrial compliance. He's also been buying property under his wife's maiden name, Helen replied, pulling out additional records. 3 parcels in the past 2 years, all adjacent to Pacific Environmental Solutions facilities, all purchased for significantly below market value. The corruption was more extensive than I'd imagined, reaching into the state regulatory system that was supposed to protect communities like Millbrook from exactly this kind of environmental crime. Richard Montrose wasn't just failing to do his job, he was actively participating in the cover-up while positioning himself to profit from the conspiracy. Helen's next revelation was even more disturbing. The environmental impact studies required for major industrial operations had been conducted by consulting firms that existed only on paper, producing reports that cleared Pacific Environmental Solutions for activities that should have triggered intensive scrutiny. The consultants listed as report authors were either fictitious or had no actual expertise in environmental assessment. How long have you known about this? I asked. I started noticing irregularities about 2 years ago, Helen admitted. Too many permits being processed without proper review, too many exceptions being granted for operations that should have been flagged for additional study. But what could I do? File a complaint against a state official based on suspicions? The isolation she described was exactly what Frank Delacroix's network counted on. Individual officials who noticed problems felt powerless to act against what appeared to be systematic corruption, reaching beyond their authority. By fragmenting oversight across multiple agencies and jurisdictions, the conspiracy had created a situation where no single person felt capable of challenging the entire system. There's something else, Helen said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 3 weeks before Marcus died, Richard Montrose requested copies of all environmental compliance records for the Route 22 Gas and Go. Said it was part of a routine audit, but he'd never made that kind of request before. The timeline was devastating. Marcus's increasing investigation of the illegal dumping had triggered a response from the corrupt state official, who had presumably reported the situation to Frank Delacroix. Within days of that records request, Marcus was dead of a supposedly natural heart attack, and Tony Castellano was pressuring me to sell the station immediately. I spent the next hour reviewing documents that painted a comprehensive picture of environmental crime extending across 3 counties and involving dozens of businesses, government officials, and waste management companies. The Route 22 Gas and Go wasn't just one location in the network. It was a central hub that processed toxic waste from industrial operations throughout the region. The health implications were staggering. Groundwater contamination was affecting drinking water supplies for thousands of people, creating cancer risks and developmental problems that would persist for decades. Soil contamination was making agricultural land unsafe for food production. Air quality in affected areas was compromised by improper storage and handling of volatile chemicals. Yet none of this environmental damage was being detected by official monitoring systems, because the people responsible for oversight were part of the conspiracy. Water quality reports were being falsified, soil samples were being taken from uncontaminated areas, and air quality measurements were being conducted when facilities weren't actively processing waste. I've been documenting everything I could find, Helen said, but I needed someone with environmental expertise to understand what it all meant. When you started asking questions about the gas station, I realized you might be the person who could finally do something about this. The responsibility she was placing on me was overwhelming, but it was also validating. My professional background and personal motivation made me uniquely positioned to understand both the technical aspects of the environmental crimes and the regulatory failures that enabled them. More importantly, Marcus's death had given me access to evidence that no outside investigator could have obtained. What I need now is proof of the actual dumping activities, I told Helen. Documents showing what's being stored where, evidence of improper disposal methods, anything that directly connects specific environmental solutions to environmental contamination. That kind of evidence would be kept at the individual facilities, she replied. But getting access would mean going onto private property without authorization, which could be dangerous if they've realized you're not the naive widow they thought you were. The risk was real, but so was the urgency of stopping crimes that were harming people every day. The conspiracy continued. I'd already committed to seeing this investigation through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal danger. Marcus had died trying to expose these crimes, and I wasn't going to let his sacrifice be meaningless. As I prepared to leave the courthouse, Helen handed me one final document that changed everything. It was a letter Marcus had written to the FBI 3 days before his death, detailing his discoveries and requesting federal investigation of the illegal dumping operation. The letter had never been sent, probably because Marcus had died before he could deliver it, but it proved that he'd been planning to expose the entire conspiracy through official channels. The letter also contained information I hadn't found in his other notes, including details about waste disposal methods that violated federal regulations and evidence of interstate transportation of hazardous materials without proper permits. Marcus had been building a case that would have triggered federal criminal charges and environmental remediation orders that couldn't be suppressed by local corruption. Now that evidence was mine, along with the additional documentation I'd gathered and the witness testimony I could obtain from people like Diane Reeves. The conspiracy that had killed my husband was vulnerable, but only if I could gather enough proof to overcome their political protection and present a case so comprehensive that it couldn't be dismissed or buried. The next phase of my investigation would require me to obtain direct evidence from the illegal dumping sites themselves, documenting the environmental crimes in ways that would hold up in federal court. It would also require me to identify additional witnesses and gather testimony that would corroborate the documentary evidence I'd collected. Most dangerously, it would require me to continue pretending to be the grieving widow while secretly building a case against people who had already killed once to protect their operation. Every day I delayed increased the environmental damage and health risks for innocent people. But moving too quickly would alert the conspiracy and give them time to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. As I drove back toward the gas station, I knew that the next few days would determine whether justice would finally be served, or whether Frank Delacroix's network would claim another victim. The evidence I'd gathered was powerful, but it wouldn't matter if I didn't survive long enough to present it. The time for passive investigation was ending. Soon, I would have to take actions that would reveal my true intentions and put me in direct conflict with people who had demonstrated their willingness to kill. But Marcus's letter to the FBI had shown me the path forward, and Helen's documentation had given me the tools I needed. The conspiracy that thought it had won when Marcus died was about to discover that his widow was far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The key to the padlock securing the underground entrance felt cold in my palm as I crouched behind Marcus's desk at 2 a.m. Above me, the gas station was dark and silent, but I knew that Tony Castigliano would begin his morning routine in exactly 4 hours. That gave me a narrow window to document what I'd discovered in the hidden storage area and gather the direct evidence I needed to prove the full scope of the illegal dumping operation. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. 3 weeks of careful preparation had led to this moment, and I'd planned every detail of tonight's mission with the precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could be fatal. The waterproof camera hidden in my jacket would capture images that no corrupt official could dismiss or explain away. The portable water testing kit in my backpack would provide chemical analysis that would hold up in federal court. Most importantly, the GPS tracking device I'd planted on Tony's truck would show me exactly where the waste was being transported after it left the gas station. The false wall behind Marcus's filing cabinet swung open silently on hinges I'd oiled during my previous reconnaissance. The narrow staircase descended into darkness that my flashlight barely penetrated, and the chemical smell that had first alerted me to the underground operation grew stronger with each step. At the bottom, the hidden storage area stretched much further than I'd initially realized, a concrete cavern that had been excavated and reinforced to handle far more than the simple fuel storage that appeared on official building permits. Rows of unmarked barrels filled the space, some leaking fluids that had created rainbow-colored pools on the concrete floor. Industrial equipment I didn't recognize hummed quietly in the corners, processing or filtering something that created a constant low vibration through the walls. Most disturbing were the additional passages leading deeper underground, suggesting that this facility was connected to other storage areas or disposal sites that might extend throughout the region. I began documenting everything methodically, photographing serial numbers, chemical warning labels, and equipment that clearly violated every safety regulation designed to protect workers and communities. The barrels contained industrial solvents, heavy metals, and toxic compounds that should have been handled by licensed hazardous waste facilities, not stored beneath a small-town gas station in containers that were already showing signs of deterioration. The water testing kit revealed contamination levels that exceeded federal safety standards by orders of magnitude. Groundwater seeping through cracks in the concrete walls contained lead, mercury, benzene, and other compounds that could cause cancer, neurological damage, and developmental problems in children. The contamination wasn't confined to this single location. It was spreading through the aquifer that supplied drinking water to Millbrook and surrounding communities. As I worked, I began to understand the full scope of what Marcus had discovered in his final weeks. This wasn't just illegal dumping. It was environmental terrorism conducted for profit, a systematic poisoning of an entire region's water supply by people who cared only about the money they made from accepting waste that legitimate facilities wouldn't handle. The sound of footsteps above me froze my blood. Someone was moving around the main floor of the gas station, their boots creating a rhythm I didn't recognize. Tony wasn't supposed to arrive for hours, and no legitimate business would bring anyone here at this time of night. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening as the footsteps moved purposefully toward Marcus's office. Light spilled down the staircase as someone discovered the open entrance to the underground storage area. I had seconds to decide whether to try hiding among the chemical barrels or attempt to retreat deeper into the facility through one of the additional passages. Neither option offered much hope of escape, but the voices I heard above me made the choice for me. "She's down there," Frank Delacroix's cultured voice carried clearly in the confined space. Helen Vasquez called to warn me that she'd been asking too many questions about property records and environmental permits. I should have dealt with this weeks ago. "The GPS tracker on my truck led us right to her," Tony Castellano replied, his tone carrying none of the deference he'd shown me during our previous conversations. "She's been following me for days, documenting delivery schedules and waste transportation routes. Whatever she's found down there, she's got enough evidence to bring down the entire operation." The revelation that they'd known about my surveillance hit me like a physical blow. My careful investigation hadn't been as secret as I'd believed, and the electronic tracking device I'd thought was giving me an advantage had actually led them directly to me. They'd been watching me while I watched them, allowing me to gather evidence only because they'd planned to eliminate me before I could use it. Dr. Whitman confirmed that the heart attack simulation worked perfectly on her husband, Frank continued, his voice growing closer as he began descending the stairs. "The compound is undetectable in standard autopsy procedures, mimics natural cardiac failure, and metabolizes completely within hours of administration. She'll suffer the same unfortunate fate as Marcus, overcome by grief and stress from trying to manage a business she never understood." The casual discussion of Marcus's murder sent rage through my system that temporarily overrode my fear. They'd killed my husband with some kind of synthetic compound designed to mimic heart attacks, and now they were planning to use the same method on me. But their overconfidence was giving me information I could use if I survived long enough to act on it. I retreated deeper into the storage facility, using my knowledge of the layout to move quietly through passages they might not expect me to know about. The additional tunnels led to other storage areas that were even more disturbing than the main facility. Spaces where human waste and medical refuse had been mixed with industrial chemicals in combinations that created toxic gas emissions. In one of the deeper chambers, I discovered evidence that explained why Richard Montrose and other government officials were so committed to protecting this operation. The illegal dumping network wasn't just profitable, it was essential to covering up environmental disasters at legitimate facilities throughout the region. Nuclear power plants, chemical manufacturers, and military installations were using Pacific environmental solutions to dispose of waste that would trigger federal investigations if handled through official channels. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving not just local corruption but national security implications that would require federal intervention to address properly. Documents hidden in waterproof containers showed connections to defense contractors, energy companies, and waste management corporations, with contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But understanding the full scope of the conspiracy wouldn't matter if I didn't survive the next few minutes. Frank and Tony had split up to search the underground facility, their flashlight beams creating moving shadows that revealed their positions as they systematically checked each storage area. I could hear them communicating through radio devices, coordinating their search with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "She's got professional equipment with her," Tony reported, his voice echoing through the concrete tunnels. "Water testing kit, professional camera, evidence collection materials." This wasn't casual curiosity. "She's been building a case against us." "Then we clean up everything," Frank replied. "Eliminate her, destroy any evidence she's collected, and accelerate the timeline for shutting down this facility. We'll blame structural problems with the underground storage and relocate operations to the backup sites in Cedar Valley." The backup sites were something I hadn't known about, additional facilities that would allow them to continue their environmental crimes even if this location was compromised. The revelation reinforced my determination to ensure that any evidence I'd gathered would reach federal authorities regardless of what happened to me. I reached the end of the tunnel system and found myself in a natural cave that connected to the underground storage facility. The cave showed signs of recent excavation, with drilling equipment and construction materials, suggesting that they'd been expanding their operations into natural geological formations that would be even harder for authorities to detect and monitor. More importantly, the cave had a second entrance that emerged near the riverbank behind the gas station, hidden by overgrown vegetation that provided perfect camouflage. If I could reach that exit without being detected, I might be able to escape and deliver the evidence I'd collected to authorities before Frank and Tony realized I'd gotten away. The climb toward the hidden entrance required me to navigate unstable rock formations while carrying equipment that could easily be damaged if I fell. Behind me, I could hear my pursuers getting closer, their search becoming more urgent as they realized the underground facility was larger and more complex than they'd expected. "Check the cave system," Frank ordered, his voice carrying an edge of panic that suggested he understood how much evidence I'd potentially gathered. "If she gets out with what she's found, we'll all be facing federal charges that no amount of political protection can handle." I reached the concealed entrance just as Tony's flashlight beam swept across the cave wall where I'd been seconds earlier. The exit was partially blocked by debris that would require careful movement to clear without creating noise that would reveal my location. Each piece of stone and vegetation I moved felt like it might trigger the sound that would bring them running toward my position. The night air outside felt like freedom after the claustrophobic underground facility, but I knew that my escape was only beginning. Frank and Tony would realize within minutes that I'd gotten away, and they'd immediately begin searching the area around the gas station. More dangerously, they'd contact other members of their network to begin damage control that might include destroying evidence at other facilities or eliminating witnesses who could corroborate what I'd discovered. I had perhaps an hour before they organized a comprehensive response to my escape, and I needed to use that time to ensure that the evidence I'd gathered would reach people who could act on it regardless of what happened to me. The portable drive containing photographs and documents was secured in a waterproof case, but getting it to federal authorities would require more than simply calling the local FBI office. My truck was parked a quarter-mile away, positioned so that I could reach it without passing through areas where Frank and Tony might be watching for my escape. As I made my way through the darkness, I used my phone to upload the most critical evidence to secure cloud storage accounts that would remain accessible even if something happened to me. The drive to Portland took 2 hours, time I used to organize my evidence and prepare the presentation that would convince federal agents to take immediate action. The documents Marcus had hidden, the photographs I'd taken tonight, the water quality data, and the witness testimony I'd gathered created a comprehensive case that revealed environmental crimes affecting thousands of people across multiple states. At the FBI field office, I presented everything to Agent Sarah Chen, a federal prosecutor specializing in environmental crimes who had the authority to initiate the kind of investigation that Frank's political connections couldn't suppress. The evidence was overwhelming, but Agent Chen warned me that the conspiracy's reach into state and federal regulatory agencies would make building prosecutable cases extremely challenging. The corruption you've uncovered extends beyond environmental crimes into areas that affect national security, she explained after reviewing the documents I'd provided. Some of these waste disposal contracts involve classified materials from defense installations, which means we'll need coordination with multiple federal agencies to address the full scope of what you've discovered. The complexity she described meant that justice would take time, but it also meant that the case was too big for Frank Delacroix's network to suppress through their usual methods of intimidation and corruption. Federal agencies with jurisdiction over environmental crimes, national security violations, and public health emergencies would all have interests in pursuing prosecution that couldn't be influenced by local political pressure. Agent Chen arranged for me to enter federal protection while the investigation proceeded, but I declined the offer. Going into hiding would mean abandoning the people of Millbrook to continued environmental exposure, while the federal case developed slowly through bureaucratic processes. Instead, I requested immediate assistance in documenting the ongoing crimes and gathering additional evidence that would strengthen the prosecution. What you're proposing is extremely dangerous, Agent Chen warned. If they've already killed your husband to protect this operation, they won't hesitate to kill you to prevent federal prosecution. The risk was real, but so was my responsibility to the community that had been systematically poisoned for profit. Marcus had died trying to expose these crimes, and I wouldn't dishonor his sacrifice by prioritizing my safety over the urgent need to stop the environmental damage and hold the perpetrators accountable. I have advantages they don't know about, I told Agent Chen. They think I'm a naive widow who stumbled onto evidence she doesn't understand. They don't realize I'm an environmental compliance officer with federal contacts and the expertise to build cases that will hold up in court. Agent Chen agreed to provide technical support and coordination with other federal agencies, but she insisted on conditions that would protect both the investigation and my safety. Any additional evidence gathering would be conducted with federal oversight, witness interviews would be recorded and secured through official channels, and emergency response protocols would be established in case the conspiracy realized the extent of federal involvement. The drive back to Millbrook felt different than my desperate escape earlier that night. Instead of running from people who wanted to kill me, I was returning as part of a federal investigation that would expose environmental crimes reaching into the highest levels of state and local government. Frank Delacroix's network had the political connections and financial resources to protect themselves from local scrutiny, but they wouldn't be able to withstand the federal response I'd triggered. As I reached the outskirts of town, I could see unusual activity around the gas station that suggested Frank and Tony were already implementing damage control measures. Additional vehicles were parked around the facility, and lights were visible in areas that should have been dark at this time of night. They were either destroying evidence or preparing to relocate operations to the backup facilities Frank had mentioned during their search for me. But their efforts at damage control were already too late. The evidence I'd gathered was in federal hands, backup copies were secured in multiple locations, and the investigation had expanded beyond anything they could suppress through their usual methods of corruption and intimidation. The environmental crimes they'd committed in pursuit of profit had finally triggered the kind of federal response that would ensure justice for Marcus and protection for the community they'd been systematically poisoning. The final phase of my investigation would require me to work directly with federal agents to gather additional evidence and coordinate the timing of arrests that would prevent the conspiracy from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses. It would also require me to maintain my cover as the grieving widow, long enough to help federal authorities build cases that would ensure maximum sentences for everyone involved in the environmental crimes and Marcus's murder. Frank Delacroix and his network thought they'd eliminated the threat when they killed Marcus, but they'd underestimated the determination of a woman who understood both the technical aspects of environmental crime and the regulatory systems designed to prevent it. Their conspiracy was about to face the full weight of federal law enforcement, and no amount of political corruption would be able to protect them from the consequences of their crimes. The emergency meeting at Millbrook Community Center was packed beyond capacity, with residents spilling out into the parking lot where speakers had been hastily installed to accommodate the overflow crowd. I stood at the back of the room, watching faces that ranged from confused to angry to terrified, as Dr. Amanda Foster from the State Health Department presented preliminary findings from the water quality emergency assessment that had been conducted over the past 72 hours. The numbers she was sharing represented a public health crisis that exceeded even my worst fears about the contamination spreading from the illegal dumping operation. Benzene levels in residential wells were 30 times higher than federal safety standards. Lead concentrations in the elementary school's water supply had reached levels that could cause permanent neurological damage in children. Most devastating of all, cancer-causing compounds had been detected in the municipal water treatment plant's intake pipes, meaning that thousands of people had been consuming contaminated water for months or possibly years. Frank Delacroix sat in the front row, playing his role as the concerned community leader with Oscar-worthy performance skills. He asked thoughtful questions about remediation timelines, offered resources from his environmental consulting company, and expressed appropriate outrage about whoever was responsible for this catastrophic situation. To anyone who didn't know the truth, he appeared to be exactly what Millbrook needed during this crisis, a knowledgeable advocate with connections to fix the problem. But I could see the calculation behind his concerned expressions, the way his eyes tracked every official statement and resident question to assess threats to his operation. He was gathering intelligence about the federal investigation's scope while positioning himself as part of the solution rather than the cause of the contamination. Most dangerously, he was identifying which residents were asking the most pointed questions about how this contamination had gone undetected for so long. Agent Chen had briefed me extensively about the delicate balance we needed to maintain during this public revelation. The community deserved to know about the immediate health risks they faced, but revealing too much about the ongoing criminal investigation could allow the conspiracy to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses before arrests could be made. My role was to observe and document reactions that might reveal additional participants in the illegal dumping network while appearing to be simply another concerned resident. Tony Castellano's absence from the meeting was conspicuous and telling. As the manager of the gas station that sat at the center of the contaminated area, he should have been facing intense scrutiny from angry residents. Instead, he'd called in sick with what Helen Vasquez had described as a sudden family emergency that required immediate travel out of state. The timing suggested that he was either destroying evidence at remote facilities or preparing to disappear entirely if the federal investigation moved toward arrests. Dr. Foster's presentation included maps that showed the contamination plume extending far beyond what I'd initially understood from my investigation. The illegal dumping hadn't just affected the immediate area around the gas station. Toxic chemicals had spread through underground waterways to contaminate wells and streams across a 20-square-mile area. Residential properties, farms, schools, and businesses throughout the region had been exposed to dangerous levels of industrial pollutants. The health implications were staggering and would persist for decades, even after the contamination source was eliminated. Children who had been exposed to lead and other neurotoxins during critical developmental periods might suffer permanent cognitive impairments. Adults who had consumed contaminated water over extended periods faced elevated cancer risks that wouldn't manifest for years. Pregnant women in the affected area were being advised to seek immediate medical evaluation for potential complications from chemical exposure. Rachel Kim from the Portland Tribune raised her hand during the question period, and I recognized her as the investigative journalist Agent Chen had mentioned might be helpful in maintaining public pressure for accountability. Her questions were precisely crafted to elicit information about regulatory oversight failures, without revealing details that could compromise the criminal investigation. Dr. Foster, this level of contamination doesn't develop overnight, Rachel said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Can you explain how environmental monitoring systems failed to detect these dangerous chemical levels before they reached crisis proportions? The question struck at the heart of the corruption that had enabled the illegal dumping operation to continue for years without detection. Dr. Foster's carefully diplomatic response acknowledged that monitoring protocols had been inadequate, while avoiding direct criticism of specific officials who might face criminal charges. We're conducting a comprehensive review of all environmental monitoring procedures in this region, she replied. That review will include examination of inspection schedules, sampling methodologies, and reporting protocols to identify systemic failures that allowed this contamination to go undetected. Frank Delacroix seized the opportunity to reinforce his helpful facade while subtly deflecting attention from his own companies. He stood and addressed the crowd with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to commanding respect in community meetings. As someone who's worked in environmental consulting for over 20 years, I can tell you that this situation represents a catastrophic failure of multiple systems, he said, his voice carrying just the right mixture of technical expertise and moral outrage. We need immediate action to identify the source of this contamination and hold the responsible parties accountable for the damage they've caused to our community. The performance was masterful, but I could see through it to the manipulation underneath. By positioning himself as an expert advocate for accountability, Frank was gathering intelligence about the investigation's direction, while influencing public opinion to support outcomes that would benefit his interests. He was also identifying potential witnesses or whistleblowers who might pose threats to his operation. Diane Reeves stood near the middle of the room, her weathered face showing the strain of someone who'd been carrying knowledge she couldn't share. When she finally raised her hand to speak, I could see the internal struggle between her desire to help the community and her fear of the consequences that might follow. I've lived in Millbrook for 35 years and I've seen things that didn't make sense at the time but are starting to fit together now, she said, her voice trembling slightly with nervous tension. Late-night truck deliveries to businesses that should have been closed, chemical smells that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and people who asked too many questions about these things suddenly deciding to move away from town. The murmur that rippled through the crowd suggested that Diane's observations resonated with other residents who'd noticed unusual activities but hadn't connected them to environmental contamination. Her statement was also a direct challenge to Frank's narrative about innocent oversight failures, implying that some people in the community had been aware of suspicious activities that might be connected to the contamination crisis. Frank's reaction was subtle but telling. His expression remained appropriately concerned, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was calculating the threat Diane represented and considering how to neutralize it. He would undoubtedly approach her after the meeting to gauge how much she actually knew and potentially offer incentives for her continued silence. Officer Jake Morrison, one of the few local law enforcement officials Agent Chen trusted to be uninvolved in the corruption, made a statement about increased security patrols in affected areas and urged residents to report any suspicious activities they observed. His presence represented the beginning of legitimate law enforcement involvement in protecting witnesses and gathering evidence that couldn't be suppressed through the usual channels of local political influence. As the meeting continued, I documented reactions and conversations that revealed the social dynamics Frank's network had exploited to operate undetected for so long. Millbrook was a community where people minded their own business, trusted authority figures, and assumed that environmental oversight was being handled competently by qualified officials. The conspiracy had taken advantage of those assumptions to conduct crimes that would have been impossible in a community with more skeptical residents and stronger local oversight. The meeting's end triggered conversations in small groups that provided crucial intelligence about potential witnesses and evidence that hadn't yet been discovered. Farmers discussed livestock health problems that might be connected to contaminated water sources. Parents shared concerns about their children's recent illnesses that could indicate toxic exposure. Business owners mentioned equipment failures and property damage that might have resulted from chemical contamination. Each of these conversations represented potential evidence that could strengthen the federal case against Frank's network, but gathering that evidence would require careful coordination to avoid alerting the conspirators to the investigation's expanding scope. Agent Chen had arranged for federal agents posing as health department officials to conduct follow-up interviews with residents who'd indicated knowledge of suspicious activities or health problems that might be related to toxic exposure. Frank approached me as the crowd began to disperse, his concerned expression perfectly calibrated to suggest appropriate sympathy for a widow dealing with environmental contamination on top of recent personal loss. The interaction felt like a chess match, where both players understood the stakes but had to maintain the pretense of a casual conversation. Vanessa, I hope you know that if there's anything I can do to help you navigate this situation, you only need to ask, he said, his voice carrying just the right mixture of professional authority and personal concern. Environmental contamination can be overwhelming for property owners, especially when you're dealing with other stresses. The offer was simultaneously genuine assistance and subtle intimidation, a reminder that he had resources and expertise that could either help or harm my interests, depending on how I chose to respond to his overtures. He was also probing for information about my knowledge and intentions, trying to assess whether I represented a threat that needed to be managed. I appreciate that, Frank, I replied, matching his tone with appropriate gratitude while revealing nothing about the federal investigation or my role in it. It's frightening to think that Marcus and I might have been exposed to dangerous chemicals without knowing it. I keep wondering if that could have contributed to his heart problems. The statement was carefully crafted to seem like the natural speculation of a grieving widow, while actually probing for his reaction to the suggestion that Marcus's death might be connected to environmental contamination. Frank's response would reveal whether he was concerned about that line of investigation or confident that the synthetic compound used to kill Marcus would never be detected in toxicology testing. Heart disease is unfortunately common in men Marcus's age, especially those dealing with business stress, Frank replied smoothly, but I caught the slight pause that suggested the question had triggered calculations about potential threats. I wouldn't torture yourself with speculation about environmental factors unless medical experts suggest that connection. The dismissiveness was too quick and too definitive, revealing that he was already prepared to counter suggestions that Marcus's death might be related to toxic exposure. His response also confirmed that the conspiracy was confident their murder method wouldn't be detected, even if investigators specifically looked for connections between environmental contamination and Marcus's cardiac event. As Frank moved on to speak with other residents, I noticed him gravitating toward people who'd expressed the most detailed knowledge about suspicious activities in the community. His conversations appeared casual and supportive, but I could see him gathering intelligence about what each person knew and assessing the threats they might represent to his operation. Diane Reeves was clearly a priority target, and I watched Frank engage her in what appeared to be a friendly conversation about her observations, while actually probing for details about her knowledge and potential willingness to share information with investigators. Diane's body language suggested she was uncomfortable with the attention, but unsure how to extricate herself from the conversation without appearing rude. The dynamic illustrated how Frank's network had operated successfully for years, by exploiting social norms and community relationships that made it difficult for potential witnesses to report suspicious activities or refuse cooperation with requests for silence. People who might have exposed the illegal dumping operation were neutralized through a combination of social pressure, financial incentives, and subtle intimidation that never crossed lines that would trigger law enforcement responses. Rachel Kim approached me as I prepared to leave, her journalist's instincts apparently detecting something in my behavior that suggested I might have information beyond what a typical resident would possess. Her questions were carefully phrased to seem like routine follow-up for her environmental contamination story while actually probing for insider knowledge about the situation's underlying causes. Mrs. Hartwell, as someone whose property is directly affected by this contamination, do you have any theories about how such extensive pollution could have gone undetected for so long? She asked, her tone suggesting professional interest rather than personal curiosity. The question created an opportunity to provide information that could support the federal investigation, while maintaining my cover as a concerned resident. Rachel's reporting could help maintain public pressure for accountability, while avoiding revelations that might compromise the criminal case being built against Frank's network. I think the most important thing is making sure we get answers about what happened and holding the responsible parties accountable, I replied, choosing words that would support continued investigation without revealing my involvement in the federal case. People deserve to know how their families were put at risk, and what's being done to prevent this from happening again. Rachel's follow-up questions suggested she understood that the contamination crisis involved more than simple regulatory oversight failures. But she was careful not to push for information that might compromise ongoing investigations. Her approach indicated that Agent Chen had been successful in coordinating with media contacts who could help maintain public attention without interfering with federal law enforcement activities. As I drove home from the community meeting, I reflected on how completely the situation had changed since my desperate escape from the underground storage facility just days earlier. What had begun as a personal investigation into my husband's death had evolved into a federal case addressing environmental crimes that affected thousands of people across multiple states. The evidence I'd gathered had triggered responses from multiple federal agencies, and the conspiracy that had seemed impossibly powerful and well-connected was beginning to show signs of vulnerability. But the evening had also reinforced how dangerous my position remained. Frank's intelligence-gathering activities at the community meeting showed that he was adapting to the threat posed by federal investigation, while continuing to identify and neutralize potential witnesses. Tony's sudden departure suggested that key figures in the conspiracy were preparing for the possibility that arrests might be imminent. Most concerning, the synthetic compound that had killed Marcus represented a sophisticated murder method that would be difficult to prove even with federal investigative resources. The federal protection Agent Chen had offered was looking more attractive as the stakes continued to escalate, but I remained convinced that maintaining my cover in Millbrook was essential to gathering the evidence needed to ensure convictions that would prevent future environmental crimes. The community needed someone with the technical expertise to understand the contamination and the determination to see justice served, even if that meant accepting personal risks that most people would consider unacceptable. Agent Chen had scheduled a secure communication session for later that evening to debrief about intelligence gathered during the community meeting and coordinate the next phase of evidence collection. The federal investigation was moving forward with bureaucratic inevitability, but the timeline for arrests and prosecutions would be measured in months rather than weeks. During that time, the conspiracy would continue trying to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and prepare defense strategies that might allow key figures to escape accountability. My role in preventing those outcomes was becoming more critical and more dangerous with each passing day. The evidence I'd provided had been essential to initiating federal involvement, but sustaining the investigation would require continued intelligence gathering and witness protection that could only be accomplished by someone who remained embedded in the community. Frank Delacroix's network had killed once to protect their operation, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they realized how much the federal case depended on my continued cooperation. The next phase of my investigation would focus on gathering evidence about the backup facilities Frank had mentioned, and identifying additional witnesses who could provide testimony about the illegal dumping operation's broader scope. It would also require me to work more closely with federal agents while maintaining my cover, a balancing act that would become increasingly difficult as the conspiracy adapted to the threat they now faced. But Marcus's murder and the systematic poisoning of thousands of innocent people demanded justice that could only be achieved through the kind of comprehensive federal prosecution I was helping to build. The environmental damage would take decades to remediate, but holding the perpetrators accountable would send a message that might prevent similar crimes in other communities. That goal was worth the risks I was accepting, even if those risks continued to escalate as the federal investigation moved toward its ultimate confrontation with one of the most sophisticated criminal networks I'd ever encountered. The federal courthouse in Portland buzzed with activity as Agent Chen led me through security checkpoints that seemed designed more for national security cases than environmental crime prosecutions. The evidence we'd gathered over the past 6 months had grown into something far beyond what I'd imagined when I first discovered those chemical barrels beneath Marcus's gas station. What had started as a quest for answers about my husband's death had uncovered a criminal network responsible for poisoning entire communities across 3 states. Frank Delacroix sat at the defendant's table wearing an expensive suit that couldn't disguise the defeat in his posture. The man who had commanded respect and fear throughout Millbrook now looked like what he truly was, a criminal facing decades in federal prison for environmental terrorism, conspiracy, and murder. His legal team had attempted every possible delay and dismissal, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the federal government's commitment to prosecution was absolute. The witness list read like a directory of corruption that had infected every level of environmental oversight. Richard Montrose from the State Environmental Agency had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony about falsified inspection reports and suppressed contamination findings. Helen Vasquez had provided documentary evidence of systematic permit fraud spanning nearly a decade. Even Tony Castellano, captured while attempting to flee to a non-extradition country, had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Judge Patricia Williams called the courtroom to order, and I took my seat in the gallery behind the prosecution team. As the primary witness whose investigation had exposed the conspiracy, I'd spent countless hours preparing for testimony that would detail everything from Marcus's murder to the sophisticated methods used to conceal environmental damage affecting thousands of people. Prosecutor David Martinez opened with a presentation that laid out the scope of crimes in stark, undeniable terms. Pacific Environmental Solutions had accepted over $400 million in illegal waste disposal contracts, dumping toxic materials in ways that contaminated groundwater across a region spanning 3 counties. The health impact included elevated cancer rates, developmental problems in children, and neurological damage that would affect victims for the rest of their lives. The financial complexity of the conspiracy was staggering. Shell companies had been created to obscure ownership of contaminated properties, allowing the network to avoid cleanup responsibilities when sites were eventually discovered. Bribes had been paid to government officials at local, state, and federal levels to suppress investigations and falsify environmental monitoring data. Legitimate businesses had been created as fronts for illegal activities, using their environmental credentials to win contracts that were actually covers for criminal dumping operations. But the most damning evidence was the systematic nature of the cover-up that had enabled the crimes to continue for years without detection. Environmental impact studies had been falsified by consultants who existed only on paper. Water quality monitoring had been conducted at times and locations designed to avoid detecting contamination. Government officials responsible for public safety had actively participated in concealing health risks that threatened entire communities. When I took the witness stand, the weight of everything Marcus and I had discovered settled over me like a physical presence. The courtroom was packed with residents from affected communities, journalists covering what had become a landmark environmental crime case, and federal officials whose agencies were implementing new oversight protocols to prevent similar conspiracies. Martinez guided me through the timeline of discovery that had begun with finding chemical odors in the underground storage area and culminated in evidence of interstate waste trafficking involving defense contractors and nuclear facilities. The jury listened intently as I described the sophisticated methods used to conceal environmental damage and the systematic intimidation of potential witnesses who might have exposed the crimes years earlier. The most difficult part of my testimony involved describing Marcus's death and the evidence suggesting he'd been murdered to prevent exposure of the conspiracy. The synthetic compound that had caused his heart attack was still difficult to detect, but federal investigators had found similar substances at other facilities controlled by Frank's network, suggesting that targeted elimination of threats was a standard operating procedure. Frank's defense attorney attempted to portray me as a grieving widow whose environmental expertise had led her to misinterpret innocent business activities as criminal conspiracies. But the documentary evidence was too comprehensive, and the witness testimony too consistent to support claims of misunderstanding or coincidence. Every aspect of the illegal dumping operation had been carefully planned and systematically concealed through methods that required expert knowledge and substantial resources. The defense strategy collapsed completely when Rachel Kim testified about her investigation into similar environmental crimes in other states, revealing that Pacific Environmental Solutions was part of a national network of illegal dumping operations that used identical methods and organizational structures. The conspiracy wasn't limited to Millbrook or even Oregon. It was a systematic criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple jurisdictions for over a decade. Dr. Amanda Foster's testimony about the health impact was devastating to any remaining sympathy for the defendants. She presented medical evidence showing that contamination from Frank's facilities had caused measurable increases in cancer rates, birth defects, and neurological disorders in affected communities. Children who had consumed contaminated water during critical developmental periods faced lifelong consequences that no amount of money could undo. The economic damage was equally staggering. Property values in contaminated areas had become worthless, forcing families to abandon homes that represented lifetimes of savings. Agricultural operations had been destroyed by soil contamination that would require decades to remediate. Local businesses had failed, as customers avoided areas known to be environmentally compromised. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from residents of affected communities, who described the personal impact of discovering that their families had been systematically poisoned for profit. Parents spoke about children with developmental delays that might have been prevented if the contamination had been detected earlier. Elderly residents described health problems that had been dismissed as normal aging, but were actually symptoms of toxic exposure. Diane Reeves took the stand to describe the atmosphere of fear that had prevented community members from reporting suspicious activities they'd observed over the years. Her testimony revealed how Frank's network had used social pressure and economic intimidation to maintain silence about activities that should have triggered immediate environmental investigations. The conspiracy's methods for suppressing opposition were as sophisticated as their environmental crimes. Witnesses who asked inconvenient questions found themselves facing sudden job losses, property tax assessments, or regulatory problems with their own businesses. Community leaders who might have organized opposition were offered lucrative consulting contracts or board positions that created conflicts of interest. Government officials were provided with plausible explanations for suspicious activities that allowed them to avoid deeper investigation while maintaining professional credibility. Tony Castellanos' testimony provided the most detailed account of how the illegal dumping operation functioned on a day-to-day basis. He described delivery schedules designed to avoid detection, storage methods that violated every safety protocol, and disposal techniques that ensured maximum contamination of groundwater and soil. His cooperation had been essential to understanding the full scope of environmental damage and identifying additional contaminated sites that required immediate remediation. The revelation that emerged during Tony's testimony was that Marcus had been targeted for elimination, not because he'd discovered the conspiracy, but because he developed a method for neutralizing the most toxic chemicals being stored at the facility. His environmental engineering background had led him to create a treatment process that could have prevented much of the contamination if implemented properly, but that same process threatened the profitability of the illegal dumping operation. Frank's network had killed Marcus not just to silence him, but to prevent him from implementing solutions that would have exposed the extent of environmental damage they'd been concealing. The murder had been both a cover-up and a business decision designed to protect hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. The trial's conclusion came after 3 weeks of testimony that revealed environmental crimes exceeding anything in federal prosecution history. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against Frank Delacroix and his primary co-conspirators. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of evidence that left no reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt. Judge Williams sentenced Frank to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, a term that effectively guaranteed he would die behind bars. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, with the length determined by their level of cooperation with the investigation and their role in covering up environmental damage. But the criminal convictions were only the beginning of accountability for the environmental crimes. Federal agencies had initiated the largest contamination cleanup project in American history, with costs estimated at over $2 billion that would be recovered through asset forfeiture and restitution orders against the convicted conspirators. The cleanup would take decades to complete, but it represented a commitment to restoring the environmental damage caused by years of criminal dumping. More importantly, the case had triggered comprehensive reforms and environmental oversight designed to prevent similar conspiracies from operating undetected. New monitoring protocols required independent verification of environmental testing, making it much more difficult for corrupt officials to suppress contamination findings. Whistleblower protection programs had been strengthened to encourage reporting of suspicious activities without fear of retaliation. The personal impact of seeing justice served was more complex than I'd anticipated. Marcus's murder had been acknowledged, and his killers had been held accountable. But that couldn't bring him back or undo the years of environmental damage that had occurred while the conspiracy operated with impunity. The satisfaction of seeing Frank Delacroix led away in handcuffs was tempered by the knowledge that thousands of people would continue suffering health consequences from toxic exposure for the rest of their lives. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the office of the Hartwell Environmental Justice Foundation, the organization I'd established using restitution funds from the criminal case. Our mission was to assist communities dealing with environmental contamination, providing technical expertise and legal support to people facing the same challenges that had confronted Millbrook. The Foundation's first major case involved a similar illegal dumping operation in Nevada, where residents had noticed unusual industrial activities but lacked the expertise to document environmental crimes or navigate federal reporting requirements. Working with community advocates and federal agencies, we were able to expose contamination before it reached the catastrophic levels that had affected Oregon. Each case reminded me that Frank Delacroix's network hadn't been unique in its willingness to poison communities for profit. Environmental crimes were occurring throughout the country, often in rural areas, where residents lacked political influence or technical knowledge to protect themselves from systematic exploitation. The Foundation's work was essential to preventing future tragedies and ensuring that Marcus's death had contributed to something meaningful beyond criminal prosecutions. The gas station that had been the center of so much criminal activity was now the site of an environmental monitoring station that tracked groundwater quality throughout the region. The underground storage facility had been excavated and properly remediated, but the monitoring equipment served as a permanent reminder of the importance of environmental oversight and community vigilance. Millbrook itself had recovered more successfully than anyone had expected. Federal cleanup efforts had restored water quality to safe levels, and economic development programs had attracted new businesses to replace those that had failed during the contamination crisis. The community had also developed a culture of environmental awareness that made it unlikely that similar crimes could operate undetected in the future. But the most important legacy of the entire experience was the recognition that environmental protection required active community participation rather than passive trust in government oversight. Residents throughout the region had learned to recognize warning signs of environmental crimes and report suspicious activities through channels that couldn't be suppressed by local corruption. As I reviewed files for our latest case, a message arrived from Agent Chen informing me that Tony Castellano had died in federal prison, apparently from a heart attack similar to the one that had killed Marcus. The timing seemed coincidental, but it served as a reminder that the synthetic compounds developed for targeted elimination were still available to criminal networks, with sufficient resources and motivation. The work of seeking environmental justice would continue, driven by the understanding that communities throughout the country faced threats from people who viewed human health and environmental protection as obstacles to profit, rather than fundamental rights that deserved protection. Marcus would have been proud of what his investigation had ultimately accomplished, even though he hadn't lived to see the conspiracy exposed and its perpetrators held accountable. His commitment to environmental protection had inspired the work that was now protecting other communities from similar crimes, ensuring that his death had contributed to something larger than personal justice. The Foundation's mission would continue as long as communities needed protection from those who would poison them for profit, carrying forward the values that had motivated Marcus's investigation, and honoring the sacrifice he'd made in pursuit of truth and environmental justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.